Hi, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to Kingdom Portions on Kingdom in Context. I'm Sean Griffin.
Shabbat Shalom. I'm Lindsay Griffin.
And Shabbat Shalom, sweetie.
Shabbat Shalom.
All right. We're here another week. This will be week 4 with the Kingdom Portions. We're still in Deuteronomy, which is awesome because Deuteronomy is a great book. It's in my top 10 list probably. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to pair that up with another small piece of the Torah itself. You know, most people commonly refer to Genesis through Deuteronomy as the Torah. Now we know that's just a cultural expression that's not literally defined in Scripture, but the word Torah just means instructions, and so the bulk of the instructions to humanity, if not all of them, is bound within those first 5 books, commonly called the books of Moses, Deuteronomy back to Genesis to Deuteronomy, and so people over time have called that the Torah. I think the Greek word is the Pentateuch, meaning the 5 books. But the word Torah itself just means instructions, right? And that's what God's instructions for us are, for our behavior and our life and our living. So we're going to pair that up with what we read today in Deuteronomy with a little bit of the Torah, as well as some of the books from the prophets, and then also the New Testament, which in the Hebrew called the Brit, Hadasha, and then also with one of the extra biblical books. So, do you remember which one we have this week?
I believe it's Jubilees. Do you want to explain real quick what extra biblical is?
Yes. So, extra biblical books are very simple concept. It's just a few hundred years ago. And actually, there was a progression, a stage of events that happened where people decided they wanted to take books out of the Bible. And so there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. And that's where, you've got books called the Apocryphal books, and then you've got what's called the extra biblical books. And most of the Apocryphals were already in the Bible, but then you've got some canons like the Eastern Orthodox canon that the Ethiopians use and have used for over 2,000 years that already has some of the Apocryphal and some of the extra biblical books still in their canon that they never took out. For example, like the book of Jubilees, which we'll read from today, and also like the book of Enoch. All right? So our modern American canon of 66 books in the Bible, that's abbreviated from what people in other countries have today and from what people in the past, even in the United States, had as their collection of books they called Scripture. So we actually decided to look into those books as well and find the matching theology, find the matching storyline, things that go along with what we're reading out of the Torah portions each week. And so that's why we do that. All right. So we're in Deuteronomy. We'll get started here. And in Deuteronomy chapter 11, we're going to start with verse 26 this week. We're going to read all the way through chapter 16, verse 17. All right. So if you're reading along in your Bibles, we always encourage that. And verse 26 says, "Look, today I set before you a blessing and a curse. There will be a blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God I'm giving you today, and a curse if you do not obey the commands of the Lord your God, and you turn aside from the path I commanded you today by following other gods you have not known. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, you are to proclaim the blessings at Mount Gerizim and the curse at Mount Ebal. Aren't there mountains across the Jordan beyond the western road? Aren't these mountains across the Jordan beyond the western road in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, near the oaks of Moreh? For you are about to cross the Jordan to enter and take possession of the land your God has given you. When you possess it and settle in it, be careful to follow all the statutes and ordinances I set before you today." I just want to stop real quick because we're about to jump into chapter 12. And sweetie, you know what this reminds me of? I think it's fascinating that they're instructed in verse 29 to talk about, to go to these mountains, Gerizim and Ebal, and to remember they separated out. Portion of them got on one mountain, the other portion got on the other mountain, and one portion declared all the blessings, and the other portion shouted back all the curses.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty fascinating. And modern, you can go in there, in modern times, those they're called mountains, but they're hills. They're large hills. You know what I mean? It's not
where we live in Colorado, they're hills.
Yeah, that's right.
Compared to what
they're
we're
not
used
like,
to.
I don't even know if they're over 2,000 feet tall. So
yeah, that's not
they're large hills, but they're not like a 14-footer or a 20-footer. So 20,000 feet is what we're getting at. Okay, like a big, massive mountain.
14er is the term.
14er is a hiking term. And
he's new to Colorado. He'll learn.
Yeah. So the idea is that these things are not, but they're large hills, and apparently the valley below them, according to people that went over there and looked at it, it creates like a natural amphitheater sound, percussion, like it just, the sound echoes across perfectly, so that you could almost, as far as the video I was watching, these guys that went over there, they could actually hear each other shouting at each other back and forth between these two mountains. So that brought an incredible amount of realism to this moment here, where they had to go up on these two mountains and shout at each other, one side the blessing, one side the curses.
What do you think the significance is of that? Like, why?
It's pretty interesting.
Why does he have them do that?
Most of the Torah is us walking out in practice stuff that we were going to do in fulfillment, when the kingdom comes.
Yeah.
So, it's a very interesting. I don't have like a definitive answer. I've heard lots of theories about it, but I don't have like a definitive answer as far as, this is a specific scripture explaining why God had them do that, beyond the obvious accountability, if you will. That
driving home the point.
Yeah, it's created between the peoples themselves. They're shouting out the instructions of God back and forth to each other, the blessings and the cursings that go with either staying in the covenant or rejecting the covenant. As what we learned last week, God defines that by forgetting him. When we stop doing the commands of the covenant, we forgot him. So in a sense of mass accountability between a group of possibly several million people, they're all shouting at each other the terms of the covenant, and the what happens if you obey the covenant, what happens if you don't obey the covenant. It's basically so everyone can say, no one, you can't claim people didn't tell you, or you weren't told.
People can't claim ignorance.
Yeah, you can't claim ignorance. So it's very interesting exercise and practice. But yeah, I'm going to pick up back here in chapter 12, and we'll keep going. Chapter 12, verse 1 says, "Be careful to follow these statutes and ordinances in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days you live on the earth. Destroy completely all the places where the nations you are driving out destroy completely all the places where the nations you are driving out worship their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every flourishing tree. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn up their Asherah poles, cut down the carved images of their gods, wipe out their names from every place. Don't worship the Lord your God this way. Instead, you must go to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling. You are to bring there your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tenths and personal contributions, your vow offerings and free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. You will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household in everything you do, because the Lord your God has blessed you. You are not to do as we are doing here today. Everyone is doing whatever seems right in his own eyes. Indeed, you have not yet come into the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God has given you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land the Lord your God has given you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all the enemies around you, and you live in security, then the Lord your God will choose the place to have his name dwell. Bring there everything I have commanded you, your burnt offerings, sacrifices, offerings of the tenth, personal contributions, and all your choice offerings you vow to the Lord. You will rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female slaves, this Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. Be careful not to offer your burnt offerings in all the sacred places you see. You must offer your burnt offerings only in the place the Lord chooses in one of your tribes, and there you must do everything I command you. But whenever you want, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates according to the blessing, according to the blessing the Lord your God has given you. Those who are clean or unclean may eat it as they would a gazelle or deer. But you must not eat the blood, pour it on the ground like water. And within your gates you may not eat the tenth of your grain, new wine or oil, the firstborn of your herd or flock, any of your vow offerings that you pledge, your free will offerings, or your personal contributions. You must eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God chooses. You, your son and daughter, your male and female slave, and the Levite who is within your gates. Remember, before the Lord your God in everything you do, and be careful not to neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land. It says, rejoice before the Lord your God in everything you do, and be careful not to neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land. And when the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he has promised you, and you say, I want to eat meat, because you have a strong desire to eat meat, you may eat it wherever you want. If the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of your herd or flock he has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat within your gates whenever you want. Indeed, you may eat it as the gazelle and deer are eaten, both the clean and the unclean may eat it. But don't eat the blood, since the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. Do not eat blood. poured on the ground like water. Do not eat it, so that you and your children after you will prosper, because you will be doing what is right in the Lord's sight. But you are to take the holy offerings you have and your vow offerings and go to the place the Lord chooses. Present the meats and the blood of your burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord your God. The blood of your other sacrifices is to be poured out beside the altar of the Lord your God, but you may eat the meats. Be careful to obey all these things I command you, so that you and your children after you may prosper forever, because you will be doing what is you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. When the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in the land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their gods, asking, how did these other nations worship their gods? I'll also do the same. You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice for their gods every detestable thing the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. You must be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. Okay, so that was chapter 12. And in chapter 12, there's quite a lot there, isn't there, Sweetie? I mean, there's some fun stuff. We've definitely seen I think the most obvious thing that sticks out to us is, there's no vegetarians. That seems to be, people that had a desire to eat meat, and God said it's okay. It's interesting. There's actually a spot in there that I thought it's interesting in verses 5 and 6 that we actually have, like a summary of the tithes and the offerings that are listed off. Yeah. So that's pretty cool, where it talks about the different types of offerings they're to bring, and it's not just talking about,
it's not just guilt offerings. It's not just sin offerings.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of different offerings that don't have much to do with sin, actually. Yeah,
it's Thanksgiving offering. I mean, there's all types of stuff that even one said your personal contributions.
Right.
So that's it's a lot to consider, because there's more in that. Of course, that could be an entire. I don't know if ministries have done entire separate videos on that concept. Yeah. But unfortunately, in a lot of modern day church atmosphere, much of that is not explained. Right. Because 99% of them think that all these instructions and rules are done away, and therefore, they have substituted themselves as the receiver of the tithe instead of the literal house of the Lord and the Levites.
Yeah.
Which is it's not really in the book. So that runs into some very uncomfortable conversations. Now, if they were just receiving gifts, that's something different, right? Because that's a personal contribution, because if someone's doing the work of the Lord, you want to, and you feel led to gift them, so to speak, in any way that you think would benefit or blessing them. That's a little different. But the specific tithes commanded for specific reasons, I think that's interesting. That I just I don't see how any modern church today should ever say we're going to take up a tithe. Well, it's time to give your tithe to us, because that's just out of context of Scripture.
Well, and in Paul's writings, he makes a distinction between the tithe and the offering, and he is admonishing the people to give offerings to those working in the ministry, and encouraging them to support people who are trying to preach the gospel basically full time. But he never says give them a tithe, because Paul knew the law, and he understood there's a difference between a tithe and an offering. And that's the other thing, though. You can get to the other end of the spectrum where you come out of the churches and you get kind of hyper militant about we don't have to support ministry in any way, shape, or form beyond maybe praying for them. And that's very clearly not taught in the New Testament. I mean, we see Paul clearly admonishing the body to support, the ministry.
Yeah, he just says don't, 2 Corinthians 8, he just talks about don't give under compulsion. Right? So someone's trying to guilt you or trick you into giving.
Right, that's why it's called an offering.
Yeah, it's a free will
offering.
It's important that your heart is there. He wants, if you are going to give to someone like that, that's not a Levite in the temple of God doing the temple services, right? Which I don't think we have that today, right? We don't have that at all. So that means everyone else is just accepting a free will love offering of some sort to compensate their time and effort. So that's very interesting to me. So we see a modern lack of a modern parallel in our modern life today. Also, verses 10 and 11 I think is interesting. Because
read 'em
yeah,
again real quick?
let me read this one again. Verse 10 says, "When you cross the Jordan and live in the land the Lord your God has given you to inherit, He gives you rest from all the enemies around you, and you live in security. Then the Lord your God will choose the place to have His name dwell. Bring there your everything I command you: your burnt offerings, sacrifices, offerings of the tenth, personal contributions, and all your choice offerings you vow to the Lord. You will rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female slaves, the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you." I think that that's fascinating because it seems interesting to me because there's a unique parallel that once there, this is actually fulfilled in the days of this little moment. He says, once we bring you into the land, then place he chooses his name to dwell. We get this idea in David's life, but David is told he can't build it, so then Solomon ends up building the temple. And then that's where they could bring and do all these festivals and feasts and bring their offerings, and they rejoiced. In the beginning it was great. Unfortunately, it seems to be consistent with the pattern. Men strayed away over time, even Solomon at the end of his life, apparently.
So you're saying that these verses were fulfilled in Solomon's reign? I'm
saying that, yeah, the part about until the moment he finds a place where his name will dwell, to choose a place to have his name dwell. Now, from one of the unique parts about these kingdom portions that we're doing every week is we're looking at them through the lens of the coming kingdom of God, which is the message that our Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, that he actually preached everywhere he went, was the gospel of the kingdom of God. And in this paradigm, we see that this whole event that takes place from the announcement in Deuteronomy, back when God and the tablets were given, the instructions of the Torah were given to the Israelites to follow and obey, and its fulfillment during the days of Solomon, when they finally get into the temple, and everything about it, as I was on a big grand scale from a bird's eye view, that is a wonderful, foreshadowing of the reign that we're going to see with the Messiah when he returns. And in that same geographical area, since that's the area he's chosen to put his name, he's going to bring down his big temple, his big house, if you will, and then he's going to be our high priest within that, where there'll be great rejoicing, and it'll be a wonderful time, since his throne is going to be on Mount Zion. And it's I just think it's a beautiful parallel, because we get the, just as in Hebrews 4 tells us that Hebrews 5 tells us that Moses was careful to make all the ornaments and the table showbread and the lampstand and everything that went inside the temple and the tabernacle, that he was careful to make that after the pattern he had seen that was shown to him in the vision on Mount Sinai of the heavenly tabernacle in heaven. Similarly, we're going to see, all the behaviors, all the instructions for the priests, everything that was given to man is what we're going to follow as resurrected saints with resurrected Yeshua in the real temple that's brought down to earth. It's called Mother Jerusalem by Paul in Galatians 4:26. And this is the real tabernacle, the real temple. It's God's house, the place of his dwelling, where his name, which means his authority, sits and dwells. And this is all these things parallel this kind of stuff that we're going to be up there fulfilling the law, because it's already being fulfilled by he and the angels, but he's going to bring his tabernacle to earth, and then as resurrected saints, we're going to be able to participate in it with him, because it is the place of our inheritance. So it's pretty beautiful.
Isn't there another parallel to Solomon's reign involving peace and having rest in the land from war and enemies? Yes, and that actually happens. I think it was in, you remember what part it was in? 2 Samuel. That's in one of our pairings, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll read on that later.
Yeah, okay.
We'll read on that later. So anyway, I just think that's fascinating. Also, if you're paying attention to some of the wording here, it can be a little confusing. This is something Lindsay and I ran into as we were studying this portion, because it says, like in verse 15, where it talks about, but whenever you want, you may slaughter, eat it within any of your gates, according to the blessing the Lord your God has given you. Those who are clean or unclean may eat it, as they would a gazelle or deer. And then over here in verse 22, we run into something that it can throw you off and make it seem like the deer and the gazelle are unclean. And so, but they're not. They're clean animals. We're actually going to read that, I think, in chapter 14. It's going to tell us they're clean. So what this is talking about, when it says the clean or the unclean both may eat it, This is talking about the ordinances, right? The sanctification instructions for the people. If they were going to come to the temple and present their sacrifices or their offerings or the tithes, they had to go through these instructions to be to be clean, to be considered clean, right? Couldn't touch anything that had died, that was unclean. You couldn't walk into the house of someone that had died. I think that's in Leviticus 21. Or you couldn't have just recently buried your father or mother or something like that, because that means you'd have touched their corpse. And just all the different rules that we read in the Torah about what makes a person clean or unclean. What he's saying right here is since you are trying to eat these clean animals and eat this meat, and it's not in the tabernacle, and it's not in the place where my name dwells, then you don't have to worry about these clean and unclean rules at this moment. You can go ahead and eat and enjoy it and do what you need to do. But those rules do apply once we get to the temple, right? Once we get to the tabernacle. So, and then I actually did a morning cup of context one time, and I'll have to link the video in the description for this. And it talked about were women really kicked out of the camp, and I had to break down the Hebrew of that word, because those clean and unclean laws that applied to women during their monthly menstrual period was only specifically talking about when they were in the camp, the part of the camp that is the actual tabernacle where they were offering sacrifices. So they just weren't kicked out of the congregation altogether. These specific rules only applied where the Levites were accepting the offerings for sacrifices. That's what all that clean and unclean was really important for. And so I just don't want people to get confused with these passages here. So that's what I thought I'd bring that up. And sweetie, did you see anything you wanted to point out?
Yeah, actually, one thing that I noticed as you were reading is, I think it's here in verse 12. Okay, so after he's commanding them the sacrifices and offerings to bring to them, he says, "You will rejoice before the Lord your God, your sons and daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you." So I think what I want to point out there is that he's talking about you're going to rejoice. And I think that for so long we've been programmed to look at the system of sacrifices as like this form of punishment on people, and this form of, oh, you sinned and now you have to come and sacrifice, one of your best of your flock, and oh, you better think twice before you sin next time. And that's kind of what we're taught about what sacrifices were for. In general, they were just all for sin and guilt, and it was.
Well, you're right. It was so they could think twice, but not in a sense of fear-induced.
Well, no, I'm
for
talking,
losing the animal, right?
Well, I'm talking about all offerings that were brought. We are taught that all offerings that were brought were this form of a solemn occasion. We're taught that you were supposed to have to feel bad. You were I understand about the sin and the guilt offerings. But all these other offerings, these peace offerings, Thanksgiving offerings, all of that, they're going and they're bringing these, and it's supposed to be a joyful occasion. They're supposed to rejoice when they're doing all of that. So I just, that's part of my perspective that's kind of changed over the last year of really studying the Torah, is realizing that the system of sacrifices within the temple, that was the way the Father prescribed worship since even before Mount Sinai. So if you look at the sacrifices as this form of worship, it doesn't seem so morbid, And
I think a lot of people get mistaken thinking it is morbid because you have the instructions for draining the blood.
Right.
If you go into, I can't remember which one it is, like Leviticus 8 and Leviticus 4. You've got these instructions for cutting up the animal in certain ways, doing things with certain parts of the animal, and then taking the meat that goes to the burnt offering. There's a lot of very detailed instructions for slaughtering the animal, basically, and then preparing it to be cooked and what to do with the other parts of it. So as the regular person doesn't go into a slaughterhouse and ask them how they do their business, they just go to the supermarket and buy the food. We're getting from start to finish the idea that they've raised their animal, they're going to bring that animal for whatever, if it's not a guilt or a sin offering, right? The other offerings were to be joyous, like we just talked about, right? Because this was part of worshiping God, and they were to be happy. Yeah. And so a lot of people think, well, wait a minute, that the animal has lost his life. Well, this is nothing different than, because all these things were burnt offerings, and they had other things that went on the meats and the seasonings.
Yeah.
I mean, these were, guys.
The recipes.
Yeah, this is a barbecue.
Yeah.
This is, think about a family occasion. You get together and it's good times. You're having a joyous occasion, and you throw your meat on the grill, and you throw your asparagus on the grill, and you know what I'm saying? And this is the same concept. They're just taking, I hate to call a priest a chef, but that's essentially, they're being given the orders on how to cook this stuff for the people. And the people ate, not the sin and the guilt offering, the atonement offerings, but the regular joyous, the free will think offerings and the different stuff. The people would eat their portion that they brought up because it was theirs.
Right. And
that's why we have the other, instructions about changing in money if you live too far away, so you can then buy what you need for your sacrifice when you get there. Because they were, that was them basically buying their food for the festival and the feast when they got there. That's why it's called a feast day.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're actually eating and you're doing it in joy.
Yeah. And
a feast has the connotation of having a good time while you do it. So this whole idea that, which I would say is what I think you're trying to get at, which is this out of context feeling that's forced onto the terminology of sacrifices in Scripture.
Yeah.
To where they're horrible and they were a burden and they're nothing but a punishment of the sorts.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? All this is they're every single time they're cooking food to eat for themselves.
Right.
Just think about that for a minute. They're cooking food so they can eat it for themselves. And in certain occasions, depending on the circumstance of that sacrifice, the priest would eat it for sin atonement. But other occasions, they're just cooking the priests are just cooking the food for the people to eat, right? So this was, they're just having a good time. This is a joyous occasion. That's why they can do this, and it can be called joyous. And this is why the law is not a burden. It's not a burden.
It actually sounds like, that would have been really nice. I mean, how great would it be to go to a family gathering and you're worshiping Yahweh all together? I mean, I know a lot of us struggle with,
And it's counted as righteousness.
Yeah, a lot of us struggle with broken families and being unequally yoked within our families and all of that. And oftentimes I just like to just imagine being at one of those feasts with that extended family, and everyone is equally yoked there, and everyone, wants to do the law and wants to obey and wants to worship Yahweh. And this is also, it leads into, when you mention to people that books like Ezekiel certainly tell us that sacrifices will resume in the kingdom in the millennial reign, a lot of people kind of freak out when you tell them that and are like, why would those ever come back? They were such a horrible, heavy burden. They were for sin. He was our final sin offering, and all of that kind of dramatic kind of reactions that people get. And in actuality, it's going to be joyous. It's going to be great. We're going to have the choicest meat. We're going to have the best cuts of meat we could ever imagine. I mean, we're going to have the best food, and we're going to get to all be together worshiping the Father and coming together, to feast and be a family all together, in His house. So it's not a bad thing that the Levitical priesthood and the system of sacrifice is going to return in the millennial reign. It's a very good thing. It's righteousness.
Yeah, so. It's literally defined as righteousness in Deuteronomy 6.
Yeah.
And that's, so it can't be a bad thing. This is why we have to make sure we're using the definitions of terms the Father gave us,
right.
and not some that people who may misunderstand the text decided to give it. Yeah. You know what I mean? And yeah, chapter 12 is good. There's a lot of fun stuff in there. And sweetie, would you like to read 13?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
This is the famous Deuteronomy Chapter 13. I think we all know what's in this chapter.
Cue the drum roll or something.
Yeah, we should all know what's in this chapter at least. All right. If a prophet or someone who has dreams arises among you and proclaims a sign or wonder to you, and that sign or wonder he has promised to you comes about, but he says, let us follow other gods, which you have not known, and let us worship them, do not listen to that prophet's words or to that dreamer. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. You must follow the Lord your God and fear him. You must keep his commands and listen to his voice. You must worship him and remain faithful to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death, because he has urged rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the place of slavery. to turn you from the way the Lord your God has commanded you to walk. You must purge the evil from you. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, "Let us go and worship other gods," which neither you nor your fathers have known, any of the gods of the peoples around you, near you or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other, you must not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity and do not spare him or shield him. Instead, you must kill him. Your hand is to be the first against him to put him to death, and then the hands of all the people. Stone him to death for trying to turn you away from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. All Israel will hear and be afraid, and they will no longer do anything evil like this among you. If you hear it said about one of your cities the Lord your God is giving you to live in, that wicked men have sprung up among you, led the inhabitants of their city astray, and said, "Let us go and worship other gods which you have not known," you are to inquire, investigate, and interrogate thoroughly. If the report turns out to be true that this detestable thing has happened among you, you must strike down the inhabitants of that city with the sword. Completely destroy everyone in it as well as its livestock with the sword. You are to gather all its spoil in the middle of the city square and completely burn up the city and all its spoil for the Lord your God. The city must remain a mound of ruins forever. It is not to be rebuilt. Nothing set apart for destruction is to remain in your hand, so that the Lord will turn from his burning anger and grant you mercy, show you compassion, and multiply you as he swore to your fathers. This will occur if you obey the Lord your God, keeping all his commands I am giving you today, doing what is right in the sight of the Lord.
Nice.
It's intense.
Well, it is intense, yeah. We've got, this is the false prophets.
Yeah.
Basically, people leaving the covenant, trying to encourage other people to leave the covenant. And one of the things I wanted to point out real quick was, remember at the end of chapter 12, we talked about Yahweh lists off, or I should say Moses, but it's listed off in verses 31 and 32 that, they were the detestable things that were taking place for religious practices of the nations around them. One of which, there's a lot of bad ones, but one of which was, sacrificing sons and daughters in the fire, right? And so they would take their sons and daughters and literally sacrifice them to Molech or just whatever regional god they called him, but it was this idea that they would give their child to him and kill them through fire. They'd burn them alive. This is not cool. This is not good. This is horrible, horrible behavior and extremely detestable. So that's why the Father's like, he does not do human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And this is a whole nother video we can get into with, the metaphoric language spoken of the Messiah. But the Messiah chose to do the Father's will for him. And he gave up his life willingly. He laid it down willingly. He was not an animal sacrifice on a stone altar that was against his will, right? This is the whole point of him. And he was murdered, by the way. He wasn't sacrificed at the hands of a priest according to the law. He was murdered by Romans and his own people that betrayed him. So it's a totally different context, but unfortunately people have just, they've followed that misteaching over time. So the point being here is that he's telling them in chapter 13, at the end of chapter 13, if you see any of these other cities start doing this detestable behavior, then go kill them all. Sounds harsh.
And burn everything.
Right? It sounds harsh. But we just had the context just defined for us at the end of chapter 12 what just a glimpse of some of that detestable behavior was. Right. Okay, so if nothing else that we want to take away from this idea was that God, with uttermost severity, protected children. And that's the thing that I would hope that people would glean from that, because, that and to juxtapose that against, to compare that against what the enemy and false ideology, false religious belief does not respect children, in fact wants to kill them in honor to their gods.
Yeah.
Okay, so this whole idea was that the Father is a good father, right? And he means that in every sense of the word. He's a good father to the fact that he wants to protect the children. And the other nations' gods, quote-unquote gods, did not want to protect the children. So that's something that always jumps out to me. I just hope people understand that's what it means when it says detestable things. And that's why they're dealt with so severely. Also the prophet, we get the famous prophet stuff.
Yeah,
right?
The definition of a false prophet is right here in Deuteronomy 13, and most of us know that. But we do see this term, false prophet, false teacher, false teaching. We see that thrown around pretty willy-nilly, actually.
Yeah.
When in reality, we have a specific definition here of what a false prophet is, and that is someone who is leading people away from the instructions of God.
Right.
We also, something that people fail to notice is that he warns us that some of these false prophets will have visions and perform miracles and predict the future, and they will just they will display genuine, what seems to be genuine miraculous powers.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are very much, swayed by the signs and wonders.
You're right.
And not paying attention to what's being taught.
I think it's in Revelation. That's why it talks about the beast that comes up at the end, near the coming of the Lord, that he has lying signs and wonders. Yeah. So but that means he's still doing a sign, right? So there's something actually happening, but it's just called a lie. And so that's what Deuteronomy 13 is defining for us. Right. And that's also why the other character mentioned with the beast in Revelation is called the false prophet, right?
Yeah.
Who goes out and does these signs on behalf of the beast to trick people, because the end result of it is, it doesn't matter if what they claimed was going to happen tomorrow happens tomorrow. That doesn't make them a prophet.
Right.
Okay? They could just be really good prognosticator with statistical analysis of behavior and whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make them a prophet automatically. The dividing line, what makes them a prophet, is, are they encouraging you towards God's instructions, to worship God, to keep his commandments? That was the ultimate litmus test, if you will, for the prophet. So no matter what they said, if they were against Torah, if they were against God's instructions for living, that disqualified them as a prophet. So that makes sense? So it's very easy to determine prophet versus false prophet.
Right.
Right? Okay, so anything else you want to talk about?
Yeah, actually something stood out to me while you were reading. And basically like verses 6 through 11. Verse 6 starts out, if your brother, the son of your mother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, let us go and worship other gods. And then basically it goes through this whole process of stoning these people, or, what it made me think of is it's in, I think it's Luke 14. Let me look that up real quick. Luke 14, verse 26. Jesus says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. So I think a lot of people hear that word hate, and we, in our modern times, we have this understanding of that word as like this terrible, terrible thing. And I'm not sure if hate is actually the word he used. I know I think it's Matthew 10. He uses a different phrasing. If anyone loves their father more than me, something like that, right?
Yeah, Matthew 10:37, I think.
Yeah.
If anyone loves their father, mother, wife, or more than me, or I guess even their own life.
Right.
So, yeah.
Basically, I just saw a parallel there. I think a lot of people hear this verse from Luke, and they're kind of shocked by Jesus making this statement that seems pretty bold, that, if someone doesn't hate these people in their own family, or even their own life, they can't be my disciple. And I think he was drawing back to this verse in Deuteronomy. I think he's pointing out how serious he is about being equally yoked, and if there's someone that's pulling you away from the instructions of God, you choose the instructions of God. You choose to love the Father first, and everyone else after that. And so
you're saying Deuteronomy 13:6 is the context for what Jesus was talking about.
That's what I think. I haven't read another verse so far in the Torah that popped out at me that made me think exactly of that verse. Oh my gosh, that's where he got that from. He wasn't just being controversial, he was actually drawing back to, some instructions about how serious it is when someone is trying to entice you away from the Father to serve other gods. And in our modern times, a lot of people, they don't realize that anything can be a god. I mean, it doesn't have to be an actual deity someone's falling down and worshiping. You can serve money over God.
Right.
So I just thought that was an interesting parallel.
Absolutely, because what Jesus says at a later time when they say that some of the people come up to him and say, hey, your mother and brother are here, and Jesus says, my mother and brother are those who do the will of God. Right. What is the will of God? Is the commandments.
Yeah.
All right, that's his will for us, simply put.
Yeah.
And so we've got, if I could quickly summarize the connector here, Deuteronomy 13 is step 1. Then we got Jesus reiterating Deuteronomy 13, talking about the dichotomy, the hyperbolic language to speak of the way you should view this with the seriousness that Deuteronomy 13 talks about, which is even if your mother, brother, sister, or wife tries to sway you away from the commandments of God, which is the will of God, then they're not acting like your family. They may be your blood family, but they're not acting like your family at that point, right? Because they're trying to lead you down the path of destruction instead of lead you along the words or encourage you to obey the words of life. So that's, I could see that, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty serious consequences for those people who are trying to do that. I mean...
Well, to the point where their whole city gets destroyed.
Yeah.
If they start, if they're... Now, this brings up an interesting thought to me is, can someone just leave covenant? So that was kind of a unique thing, right? Could someone just... And as far as I've read and understood from the Torah, about the instructions of the law, they had to leave the land if they were going to do that. Once they got into the land, at least at this point in the timeline, right? So once they couldn't consider themselves Israel and start following another covenant and worshiping another God and doing different and stop doing the commandments of God. So if they were living in the land of Israel that he was leading them into at this point in history, and they tried to stay in that land and stop doing the terms of the covenant, then judgment came on them.
Yeah.
But if they just wanted to leave the covenant, they would have to move out of the land, as far as I can understand. But to stay in the land and stop doing the covenant results in the penalties. Does that make any sense?
Kind of.
So, otherwise, you've got
I'm
someone
not
saying...
familiar with anything that says if you're going to stop doing the covenants, you have to leave the land. I'm not sure where you're drawing that from.
Clearly we've got, in the course of history, in the kings that come after Solomon, we've got lots of them that leading the people astray, and to the point of severe apostasy, to the point where they've forgotten God altogether, and they're worshiping Baals and Molech and Ashtaroth poles and all that kind of stuff. The reason why the land vomited them out, God scattered them and divorced them out as a result of that. Does that make sense? So this whole concept was, as he's saying in these previous 11 chapters of Deuteronomy, I'm taking you into this land of inheritance. I'm taking you here. These are the instructions, the ordinances and the rules. These are the statutes and the commands that you need to follow while you're in the land. And if you don't, you're going to get kicked out, right? So, but to those in the severe circumstances, like you read at the end of chapter 13 here, to those who have rebelled against God, they've forgotten God, they've stopped doing his covenants, and they're trying to stay in the land, then judgment comes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
For those who are willing to actually go judge them, right? So, for example, we read at the end of 13 here, and verses, what looks like verses 12 through 18, right? That if they hear about wicked men who've sprung up and are leading the inhabitants of a city astray to worship gods that's not Yahweh, other people are supposed to go and take care of them and address them, okay?
After investigating everything thoroughly.
Right, they've got to go make sure, It says, verse 14, you are to inquire, investigate, and interrogate thoroughly. If the report turns out to be true, that this detestable things happen among you, you must strike down the inhabitants of the city with the sword. So the point is, on both sides of the law, both those who are to keep the law and those who are to enforce the law.
Yeah.
Okay? Everyone in Israel was to enforce the law. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's why Deuteronomy goes through this concept. And we actually see this play out later in the book of Judges with the Benjaminites, which is sad. But the Benjaminites leave, they stop doing the terms of the covenant, so they leave covenant, but they're still in the land. And they do something horrible that gets the attention of all the other surrounding tribes, and then there's civil war. Okay? So the other tribes came forward, and a guy had to put a call out, I don't remember his name right now, and said, look, this is what's going on. This is what happened from the tribe of Benjamin, and he had to send out
it was the guy whose concubine was
Well, I don't know his name.
Right?
Yeah, I'm trying to keep it, PG rated. So the point is, he had to send out notification to the other tribes about, hey, here's what Benjamin doing, okay? The other tribes had to step up and willingly go and fulfill Deuteronomy 13. They had to step up and say, we're going to go handle this. We're going to go police this, if you will. And the military showed up. Right? They brought their fighting men, and they were like, we're going to go fight against Benjamin. And they did. And it was bad for Benjamin. So I just wanted to draw that conclusion, because this is what we call rightly dividing the law. You're rightly dividing the word of truth. When you have circumstantial parameters to these instructions. Okay, so this is why we're given the definition of a false prophet. We're given the definition of people that are leaving the terms of the covenant but yet want to stay in the land of promise around other people who are trying to obey the terms of the covenant.
Yeah.
So what happens is you get people drawing you away to destructive behavior, to bad things. So God was trying to keep the entire land free of idolatry. Okay, people that would draw them away from the commands of God. And this was an enforcement act that he's explaining here. And so I just think it's interesting because you can't just willy-nilly. The reason I say this is because people that do not understand have never taken the time to actually read the Old Testament, and they've just had someone tell them at some point in their life the law of God's done away with. We don't do those things. We don't do sacrifices. We don't stone people anymore, right? So they throw out these crazy hyperbolic terms that are way out of context. And not only does it not line up with Scripture, but they're just way out of context, and everything about what this negative derogatory speech that goes towards saying, oh, they're just, they're trying to be Judaizers, or you just pick a derogatory, inflammatory statement that's made, right?
Do you send your woman outside of the city when she's on her monthly?
Right, exactly, because they don't know the law.
Right.
They don't have a clue about it, but yet they're trying to say it's bad and that it shouldn't be kept. And when they do that, they're like, oh, and one of the big one that comes up from a lot of people, yes, even believers in church, because they haven't taken the time to look at it, they'll say, oh, well, so I'm just supposed to start stoning people now?
Right.
Or you're just going to start stoning people?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, there was a process. There was instructions for how to do that, circumstances. It was an actual enactment of judgment.
Right.
They had judges. There was an actual court scenario where they actually had to, there wasn't just people willy-nilly picking up stones.
Right.
So when we actually see that in the New Testament, at one point when Jesus says something and people pick up stones to stone him, they're not following the law, guys. That was erratic, irrational behavior that was taught from the cultic ways of the Pharisees.
Yeah.
This was not Scripture. Okay? That was not lawful, and that type of behavior is not what's explained in the judgment and penalties carried out for people who are going against the law. Okay? So I want to just kind of take some time with that, because this is not only is this a famous chapter that's misquoted and used out of context, but many people don't even understand the basic parameters that go into this chapter about God enforcing punishment for those who've rejected His covenant, yet are still trying to be around people trying to keep His covenant. Right? So you don't have peace at that point. You have discord. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Sorry. Okay. Do you want to read 14, or do you want me to read 14?
I think it's your turn.
Okay. So chapter 14, we'll pick it up here. It says, "You are the sons of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or make a bald spot on your head on behalf of the dead. For you are a holy people belonging to the Lord your God. The Lord has chosen you to be a special people out of all the people on the face of the earth. You must not eat any detestable thing. These are the animals you can eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the ibex." I've never had any ibex, but that's ibex. That's pretty tasty.
Oh, keep reading.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. Okay.
Just need to get a little drum set for the background, huh?
Okay. So the antelope and the mountain sheep. You may, that's if you can catch the mountain sheep. You guys ever seen those guys move? Those mountain sheep, they're just laughing at you, spitting on you from like 30 feet up. They don't care.
All right, Mr. Stand Up.
No, I'm serious. It's, baby, mountain sheep are, unless you
They aren't very friendly, you're right.
Okay. Dude have to be good with a slingshot back then to get a mountain sheep. All right. You may eat any animal that has hooves divided in two and choose the cud. But among the ones that chew the cud or have divided hooves, you may not eat these: the camel, the hare, the hyrax, though they chew the cud, they do not have hooves. They are unclean for you. And the pig, though it has hooves, it does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. You must not eat their meat or touch their carcasses. You may eat anything from the water that has fins and scales, but you may not eat anything that does not have fins and scales. It is unclean for you. You may eat every clean bird, but these are the ones you may not eat: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the various kinds of falcon, every kind of raven, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the gull, various kinds of hawk, the little owl, the long-eared owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the cormorant, the stork, the various kinds of heron, the hoopoe, and the bats." Some of those birds I've never heard of in my life. But I'm not a bird watcher of any kind. I mean, respect people that watch birds, but I'm not a bird watcher. I will watch you watch the birds. That's about it. But I will not watch them myself. Verse 19, all winged insects are unclean for you. They may not be eaten, but you may eat every clean flying creature. You are not to eat any carcass. You may give it to a resident alien within your gates, and he may eat it, or he may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people belonging to the Lord your God. You must not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Verse 22, each year you are to set aside a tenth of all the produce grown in your fields. You are to eat a tenth of your grain, your new wine and oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, in the presence of the Lord your God, at the place where he chooses to have his name dwell, so that you will always learn to fear the Lord your God. But if the distance is too great for you to carry it, since the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far away, and since the Lord your God has blessed you, then exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place the Lord your God chooses. You may spend the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, beer, or anything you desire. You are to feast there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your family. Do not forget the Levite within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. And at the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year and store it within your gates. Then the Levite who has no portion or inheritance among you, the foreign, resident, fatherless, and widow within your gates may come, eat, and be satisfied. And the Lord your God will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. So it's, so we got a list of clean and unclean birds, which,
Links back to Leviticus
11, right? Leviticus 11. And then we've got, what else do we got? They can eat the sacrifice of the meal. What is it? They have to, if the distance was too great. So these particular, and this is what we talked about earlier from chapter 12.
Right.
But if the distance was too great, and I guess if they lived in like northern Israel, and they didn't want to take their animals that they were going to use for the sacrifice for the feast all the way down to Jerusalem, then they would just take the equivalent of that money for those animals, and then go to buy those same animals once they got down to Jerusalem to use for the feast. And so that's just kind of made it easier for travel, right?
Yeah.
That way, in my opinion, you're not, there's some practicality there, obviously, but not just to make your travel lighter, right? Because we all know, like, traveling with multiple people is not always easy. It can be sometimes difficult, but now throw in animals in the mix,
yeah,
right? And all the requirements that they have. So you have, speaking of animals, we have a dog that's singing to us in the background.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah,
we have to try and contain them when we film.
Or
and sometimes
any
they don't
various
like
tricks that we can figure out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they would just be sitting on our laps, and they're way too big for that.
Yeah, I didn't have any bones for them today. So if you hear some occasional howling or barking,
right.
Just ignore it. It's just the doggos.
They're fine.
Yeah.
They
have rawhides. They would just rather be in here chewing their rawhides with us.
Yes,
so.
Specifically chewing them on my feet.
Yeah,
That's
they like to sit on his feet and chew. It's weird.
So, all right. So basically, this is a very practical instruction, right? You live far away, instead of trying to travel with not only your family and all those people, but as well as all the animals you would need, just bring the money equivalent, buy the animals when you get there.
Right.
So that way it just makes it easier and probably a little more joyous to travel.
Right.
Right.
And that's actually what, the infamous money changers in the temple, that's actually what, that was the service they were providing they were selling the birds and the, goats and the different animals for the sacrifices. But weren't they like trading out the money and...
Yeah, there was some
chucking and jiving going on there. There was some not so honest behavior happening.
Yeah,
with the money changers.
There was some interesting, supposedly the money changers. That's its own study, but as far as the history of that and what's going on there is...
I'm just saying it had more to do than them just selling these things in the boundaries of the temple. It wasn't just that they were just selling all kinds of random merchandise and books and coffee and stuff.
Right.
They were. This was a normal part of these feast days where they would be providing the animals for the people who couldn't bring their animals, but they had corrupted that.
That's right. And it just definitely helped keep down transportation charges. Well, just the money, and if you did have to stay overnight for some reason, then you're having to pay for a space to keep your animals as well. So there's,
Yeah.
for like I think that on a variety of levels, this whole law was all built into making it easier for you.
Yeah.
Right. So it could be a feast and a joyous occasion.
Yeah.
But if you're going to the temple and someone doesn't give you the fair equivalent value
Right.
of money for what you're trying to get,
Right.
suddenly it's a contentious occasion.
Right.
Right? Suddenly you're not at peace,
Yeah.
and this isn't a joyous event because you're having to question the guy transferring your money out to
Yeah.
you. Does he give me what I'm supposed to have?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then there's animosity between your brethren, and suddenly you're in Leviticus 19:21. All right, and now you gotta wait. Now I gotta buy an extra chicken or something so I can make atonement for the hate I have in my heart.
Yeah.
For the money changer,
Yeah.
right? So like you've got
Yeah.
you've got some issues there, right?
Some good self-awareness, though.
Yeah, yeah. So I just think that's why Jesus was so adamantly upset.
Yeah.
This was supposed to be a light burden.
Right.
This was supposed to be a joyous occasion.
Right.
Whenever they went to the temple for feasts and sacrifices and offerings. And the Pharisees had set up a system that was a burden.
And taking advantage of people with legitimately true faith who were trying to come and worship God. And, we definitely see that in modern times, with people taking advantage of the faithful when it comes to money. So.
Absolutely. It's sad, but it happens. And anyway, there's a lot of us who've fantasized about taking a piece of rope like Jesus and telling people to me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do it in anger. I would have just never mind. Just to see them, just to like snap a rope like when Indiana Jones, just snap a whip and get their attention, not to really hit them with it, right? Just get their attention and be like, hey, this is not in the Bible. What are you doing? It's not in the Bible. Stop misleading people, read your Bible, and I would snap the whip again and then leave. So it would just be an event. So anyway.
Sounds like it would be more comical than intimidating.
No, I mean, I would snap the whip really hard, so it would be, what? You ever seen one of those bull whips, babe? They're intimidating. Anyway.
Chapter 15.
Chapter 15, you want to read chapter 15? Okay.
Yeah, I'll read.
All right, let's read.
All right, chapter 15. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how to cancel debt. Every creditor is to cancel what he has lent his neighbor. He is not to collect anything from his neighbor or brother because the Lord's release of debt has been proclaimed. You may collect something from a foreigner, but you must forgive whatever your brother owes you. There will be no poor among you, however, because the Lord is certain to bless you in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance. If only you obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow every one of these commands I am giving you today, when the Lord your God blesses you as he has promised you, you will lend to many nations but not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. If there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers within any of your gates in the land the Lord your God is giving you, you must not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. Instead, you are to open your hand to him and freely loan him enough for whatever he has. Be careful that there isn't this wicked thought in your heart. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is near, and you are stingy towards your brother and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty. Give to him, and don't have a stingy heart when you give, and because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you do, for there will never cease to be poor people in the land. This is why I am commanding you. You must willingly open your hand to your afflicted and poor brother in your land. If your fellow Hebrew, a man or woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, you must set him free in the 7th year. When you set him free, do not send him away empty-handed. Give generously to him from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. You are to give him whatever the Lord your God has blessed you with. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I am giving you this command today. But if your slave says to you, I don't want to leave you, because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, take an awl and pierce through his ear into the door, and he will become your slave for life. Also treat your female slave the same way. Do not regard it as a hardship when you set him free, because he worked for you 6 years, worth twice the wages of a hired hand. Then the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. You must consecrate to the Lord your God every firstborn male produced by your herd and flock. You are not to put the firstborn of your oxen to work, or shear the firstborn of your flock. Each year you and your family are to eat it before the Lord your God, in the place the Lord your God chooses. But if there is a defect in the animal, if it is lame or blind or has any serious defect, you must not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. Eat it within your gates. Both the unclean person and the clean may eat it, as though it were a gazelle or deer. But you must not eat its blood. Pour it on the ground like water. That's chapter 15.
There's a lot in there. It's always good to have your debts canceled. That's always nice.
Yeah, imagine if our world actually ran on the law of God, you know. I mean, our economic system would look way different.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of this actually, we're seeing kingdom behavior in this chapter, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. With the, not only just the canceling of debts, but then lending to the poor, because in the kingdom, as we have in multiple passages of the prophets, all the wealth will be brought to the New Jerusalem.
Right.
So the entire wealth of the world. Enoch 52, 51, 52, I believe, as well as Zechariah 14 and Isaiah 61, I believe. Just talks about, and there's other places, even in Revelation 21,
Yeah.
talks about all the wealth of the surrounding nations will be brought to the New Jerusalem, all right? And that way, the whole economic system is going to be different.
Yeah.
It's going to be radically changed, and it's going to be done, administered with justice,
Yeah.
right? Instead of thievery and greed and envy, strife, and power, it'd be administered with justice. And so, I just think that's fascinating.
I find verse 6 interesting when he says, when the Lord your God blesses you as he has promised you, you will lend to many nations but not borrow. You will rule over many nations but they will not rule over you. And we don't see that fulfilled in the physical kingdom of Israel from, back in the day. We don't see that happening. We don't see other nations
short
serving
time period
Israel.
During Solomon, it was the closest we get. But for the rest of
even then, nations didn't serve them.
Right.
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 So we can see that some of this talk is proleptic. Some of it is talking about, well, it's not proleptic, but, it would be.
Yeah, it'd be proleptic.
It's talking about something that's going to happen in the future.
That's right.
But it wasn't fulfilled with that first establishing of the nation of Israel.
But it is fulfilled in the New Jerusalem.
Exactly.
Because all the survivors of the day of the Lord who will come and encamp around the beloved city will need provisions from it, and as they repopulate what was destroyed on the day of the Lord and the 42-month reign of Apollyon, as they rebuild and repopulate, they're gonna start their own version of economics that's gonna be carried out according to the law of God, which is what is gonna be amazing about it, which is why there'll be peace.
Yeah.
Which is why they are beating their swords into plowshares, right? So it's a wonderful little idiomatic phrase about how instead of training for war, we'll be training to produce things that are good, produce life, peace, stable society, if you will. So it is. I just want to encourage folks that there is no dystopian future. There is kingdom future.
Yeah.
That's
the truly benevolent dictatorship.
That's right.
It's not going to be a democracy.
This lie that we see continually perpetuated in modern movies, that there's a dystopian future coming and the world will collapse and break and everything. No, there's a Messiah coming who's going to reign. There's going to be some bad time. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. That's what we'll call the tribulation period that leads up to the return of Messiah. But once he returns, there's going to be an amazing healing of the land, of the people. The city of God, the house of God will be here. The Messiah will be reigning from Mount Zion. Everyone will be learning these ways of righteousness from his Torah. And so it's going to be a bright future. So just want to encourage folks with that. Also, I thought it was interesting that they are to consecrate their firstborn animals.
Yeah.
Which, I think it's pretty interesting that even within the animals, he's basically saying, just take note of the firstborns.
Yeah.
So there's this unique theme all throughout Scripture where we're got this idea of the firstborn, right? When they left Exodus in Egypt, it was the Egyptians' firstborns that died with that last plague, the 10th plague. We have Yeshua is called the firstborn of all creation. He's also called the firstborn among the dead, the first of the, So you've got this interesting parallel all throughout that is, that would be a place where I would say, it's pointing towards Yeshua, which is beautiful. And so even not only did the firstborn males of the family have to be consecrated, but also of the flocks of animals as well.
Right.
So it seems to be important. So it's really amazing. Chapter 16. Do you want me to read this one?
Yeah, and I think we only are going to verse 17.
Verse 17. Okay. Verse 1. Observe the month of Abib and celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, because the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by nights in the month of Abib. Sacrifice to the Lord your God a Passover animal from the herd or flock in the place where the Lord chooses to have his name dwell. You must not eat leavened bread with it. For 7 days you are to eat unleavened bread with it, and the bread of hardship, because you left the land of Egypt in a hurry, so that you may remember for the rest of your life the day you left the land of Egypt. No yeast is to be found anywhere in your territory for 7 days, and none of the meat you sacrifice in the evening of the first day is to remain until morning. You are not to sacrifice the Passover animal in any of the towns the Lord your God is giving you. You must only sacrifice the Passover animal at the place where the Lord your God chooses to have his name dwell. Do this in the evening as the sun sets, at the same time of day you departed from Egypt. You are to cook and eat it in the place the Lord your God chooses, and you are to return to your tents in the morning. You must eat unleavened bread for 6 days. On the 7th day there is to be a solemn assembly to the Lord your God, and you must not do any work. You are to count 7 weeks, counting the weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. You are to celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God with the freewill offering that you give in proportion to how the Lord your God has blessed you. Rejoice before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to have his name dwell. Your son and daughter, your male and female slaves, the Levite within your gates, as well as the foreign resident, the fatherless, and the widow among you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Carefully follow these statutes. You are to celebrate the festival of booths for 7 days when you have gathered in everything from your threshing floor and winepress. Rejoice during the festival, you, your son and daughter, your male and female slaves, as well as the Levite, the foreign resident, the fatherless, and the widow within your gates. You are to hold a 7-day festival for the Lord your God in the place he chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, and you will have abundant joy. All your males are to appear 3 times a year before the Lord your God in the place he chooses, at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of booths. No one is to appear before the Lord empty-handed. Everyone must appear with a gift suited to his means, according to the blessing the Lord your God has given you. Interesting. So right back to it, right? It's a free will offering for these feasts, and it's a gift suited to his means. So we read that also, I can't remember which verse it is in Leviticus, but when it talks about the people bringing certain types of offerings for atonement, also when those who had leprosy had to bring their offering or their sacrifice for the cleansing process, when they brought that to the priest, if they were poor, they could bring a substitutionary value, right? So it wasn't a goat, it was just, I think, a hen or something, like a chicken. I have to go back and look at the exact animals. Or a turtle dove, that's right, yeah. So it was, the idea was, he took into account your level of income and your means, which he's saying at this point, bring your free will offering in proportion to what you got, know? And it's not in proportion to your gratefulness or your thankfulness or your love for him. It's just in proportion to your. He doesn't want you to be stressed out financially, right? So it wasn't this idea. He didn't say bring your $1,000 seed offering so that I can give you $10,000.
Yeah.
No, he said bring what you got in proportion to what you got.
Right.
That's so clear. The Father doesn't want to burden us to guilt us into an offering that's going to hinder us. You know what I mean? And put us, because what happens when there's financial instability, right? Very often you see a disruption in the relationships in the home. Right? So you have instability there too. And that's, the Father's thought all this out. This is not, he's literally 20 steps ahead of us, right? He's 1,000 steps ahead of us. Like whichever way you want to talk about it. He's thought all this out, and he knows what's good for us, and it's built into every single instruction he gave us.
Yeah, and one thing I noticed, I didn't notice a mention of the Feast of First Fruits in that list of feasts.
Right, you have the Feast of Weeks, Unleavened Bread, and then the Feast of Booths.
He mentions Unleavened Bread, Weeks, and Tabernacles, but he doesn't mention First Fruits. Is there possibly a video people could watch to maybe understand why First Fruits is not mentioned in these significant feasts?
Yes.
We can't get into it here.
Yeah.
But Sean and I figured this out a little while ago, and it's pretty interesting.
I'm gonna put the link in the description, guys. It's a video titled Acts 2 Nothing New, and it's one I did for the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, Shavuot, and it's a special video that breaks down this idea, and I'll just let you watch it. But basically, the Feast of First Fruits and the Feast of Weeks is a double-fold festival,
Right.
and it's the same thing.
And we've been taught for a very long time that first fruits is at the time of Passover and of unleavened bread, and that Yeshua his resurrection was on first fruits, and that's just what I was always taught. And until I actually started reading Leviticus 23 and really slowly reading it and taking the time,
Yeah.
I started to realize that that's not the case. First fruits is actually on Shavuot. So
Yeah.
that would be a good video to watch for some further context on that little gem if you're interested. So
Yeah.
I just had to plug that for you.
Yeah, and put all your disagreements on that video's comments.
Yeah.
And we can hash it out
Yeah,
on
go
that video's
disagree over
comments.
there and we can figure it out
It's
over
still
there.
the same channel, but it's called Acts 2 Nothing New. It's another
Yeah.
video, and that way we can keep this comment bar
Right,
free from a bunch of conversation that's already answered on that video over there.
Right.
So it's up to you if you feel led to investigate that, because that's just another example of something of a modern tradition, if I could say it like that, that's carried over from modern day Judaism
Yep.
into the Messianic concept, into this idea of Christians who realize the law is still relevant, God's instructions for living are still applicable for our lives, and they seek to do them. And unfortunately, since mainstream Christian churches are not talking about it and teaching it, they immediately run to Judaism.
Right.
Guys, and if you don't understand what Judaism is, which a lot of people don't, it's not Messianic faith, it's
Right.
not Torah observance, it's different. It's different. It's a different religion altogether.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's not just because they reject the Messiah.
Right.
That's a big piece of it. But there's other things they reject and let the Talmud supersede. And so that it's another religion altogether. I've spoken about it in multiple videos. But unfortunately, stuff like that, little misunderstandings like that, is a great example of, and it's a good-hearted mistake. Don't get us wrong.
It comes from people looking
Yes.
for Jesus in the feast and looking for how he fulfilled the feast. And so it comes from the right place in the heart, but
Yes.
it's because people are focused on looking for him in the feast instead of the kingdom in the feast. You know, people have kind of just over time, it seems like, fit in where they think these feasts are in his first coming, and first fruits has just always been taught that he fulfilled that at his resurrection. We believe he fulfilled it in certain ways on the day of Pentecost, you know, but that's a different study and a different video, and the other video explains it. But I just thought it was interesting here. He lists these three major feasts, and he doesn't mention first fruits as this separate feast, because it's actually the same. It's the same. It's a double-fold feast on Shavuot. You have Shavuot and first fruits.
And some people would say, why didn't he mention Passover in this? Well, because Passover is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Right. Well, and he explains it earlier. But
yeah. But I'm just saying, it's like, just in case people try to get, I don't want to say antagonistic, but just in case they get kind of confused on that point, because Passover is built up to be such a big feast to be kept every year. It is mentioned here, it's being lumped into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because that's what it's also spoken as in the same vernacular and lumped into as the beginning. Passover is considered the beginning day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that's what we see in the Gospels as they observe it. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I think that it's pretty amazing because he says it again. I just want to look at this one more time. He says it again, that when you do these things, it will be joy for you. So it's in verse 15. You are to hold the 7-day festival for the Lord. The Lord will bless you all the work of your hands and your produce, and you will have abundant joy. Yeah. All right. So the whole purpose of this was to have, we're talking good times, good feelings. You're considered righteous for doing these things. These are amazing. It's simplicity. It's just having, these are not burdensome instructions, and that's what we hope to portray as we read this and explain some of this stuff and really dig into it, because there's nothing but joy in the house of God. All right. Yeah. So when the kingdom comes and we're doing the same behavior, there's nothing but joy in the house of God. Right. So we've been given the behavior that we're going to be doing in the millennial reign already was given to mankind. So the same behavior that he is doing in his house, which is above the firmament currently, it's a place of joy and happiness, right? So it's already happening, and he's doing the same instructions. All right. So I just hope people really take that away from this week, is that all this instructions leads to your joy and your fulfillment in life. None of this is a burden. And anyone that would tell you that doesn't know what he's talking about. All right?
He needs to read it, actually.
Yeah, he needs to read his book. So what pairing do we have from, so we finished our traditional portion, but what pairing do we have for the Torah this week? It looks like
Leviticus 9.
Leviticus 9.
Look over there, I'll read that.
And yes, that was excitement in my voice, because we like Leviticus.
We love Leviticus, seriously.
Because it's so much fun.
It's so meaty, and really
And you're pulling up to a buffet.
When you understand Leviticus and you're familiar with Leviticus, books like Hebrews, you can totally explain that to people.
Jesus is more relevant than you've ever imagined in your life. If you understand Leviticus, you'll appreciate your Messiah 10 times more, I promise. So,
and be able to picture like what it is that he does for you, what it means to say Jesus is my high priest, Yeshua is my high priest.
Yes.
Okay, so we paired Leviticus 9 verses 3 through 17. And tell the Israelites, take a male goat for a sin offering, a calf and a lamb, male yearlings without blemish for a burnt offering, an ox and a ram for a fellowship offering to sacrifice before the Lord, and a grain offering mixed with oil. For today the Lord is going to appear to you. They brought what Moses had commanded to the front of the tent of meeting, and the whole community came forward and stood before the Lord. Moses said, "This is what the Lord commanded you to do, that the glory of the Lord may appear to you." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Approach the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering. Make atonement for yourself and the people. Sacrifice the people's offering and make atonement for them as the Lord commanded." So Aaron approached the altar and slaughtered the calf as a sin offering for himself. Aaron's sons brought the blood to him, and he dipped his finger in the blood and applied it to the horns of the altar. He poured out the blood at the base of the altar. He burned the fat, the kidneys, and the fatty lobe of the liver from the sin offering on the altar, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He burned up the flesh and the hide outside the camp. Then he slaughtered the burnt offering. Aaron's sons brought him the blood, and he sprinkled it on all sides of the altar. They brought him the burnt offering piece by piece, along with the head, and he burned them on the altar. He washed the entrails and the shanks, and burned them with the burnt offering on the altar. Aaron presented the people's offering. He took the male goat for the people's sin offering, slaughtered it, and made a sin offering with it as he did before. He presented the burnt offering and sacrificed it according to the regulation. Next he presented the grain offering, took a handful of it, and burned it on the altar in addition to the morning burnt offering. I mean, right there we see something explained from the book of Hebrews that people are often confused by, where it talks about Yeshua not needing to make any sin offering for himself before he enters into the temple. So that's not saying that sacrificial offerings in and of themselves are done away with and gone. It means Yeshua, after being raised from the dead, is completely perfected. He lived a completely sinless life, and now he's also in a form of a body that is incapable of sin anyways. He doesn't need to do what Aaron just did here and make a sin offering for himself before he ascends up into the heavenly tabernacle and goes into the sanctuary.
That's right.
So.
And that's beautifully said. And that's also, we're actually seeing the instructions once they are in the tabernacle, doing the offerings of different reasons. Now we paired this up because of all the offerings that were listed in the chapters that we just read from Deuteronomy 12 through 16 and 17. And that's where, just to give you an idea, this was the practical application of them doing the offerings. She made a great point about how the high priest himself had to go through certain things to do the offerings, as well as what I was talking about earlier when I said that these things are just, they're just cooking a meal for you, right? And we just get the beginning process, as was read right here, about him doing certain things with certain parts of the animal. Then they had certain restrictions and instructions for the blood, and then you put the rest that was available for the burnt offering. Guys, whenever you see the term burnt offering, just think that's the meat you're going to eat.
Barbecue.
That's the barbecue you're throwing on the grill, right? Because that's what this was. It was to burn it, to cook it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. To cook it thoroughly till the lifeblood was out. And then the people would eat it. And that's why he threw the grain on there too. He's throwing on some seasoning, some herbs, some grain. He's making a little meal, right? He's throwing it on the bar. That's... Anyway, I just think people kind of skip over the practicality of that. Right? And they have this strange idea in their head of
They see it as a weird ritual.
Yeah, some
they
kind of
see
strange,
it as some ritualistic sacrifice, and
because we've grown up in a world around us that mocks these things,
right.
And we see a false institution called Catholicism that goes through their own strange rituals,
right.
with incense that they're shaking up and down the aisles and doing different things. You know what I'm saying? So that's all I'm saying. That's a horrible fakery, if you will, of what God described in His law.
Right.
What God described in His law is laid back to the degree of, its practicality in our life. Right? This is not strange stuff. Guys, this is simply, you could be going out with friends and family, and as long as your high priest was there. I'm just kind of glibly talking here, and you could cook up a meal. The high priest does what he does. He's actually the chef. He's doing what he's doing with the pieces of the meal, and then you guys eat it, and you have a good time talking and enjoyment. That was the whole point. It was considered to be a good time, a good occasion, unless it was a specific atonement or
right.
a day of solemnness
right.
or whatever. But those were less than the times of joy.
And also,
right?
those are specifically called solemn assemblies.
That's right.
They are set
right.
apart as the time to be solemn about it.
Yeah.
But otherwise, my dad would love it. My dad's a
That's
total
right.
barbecue guy. He built his own smoker and just won a barbecue competition. So I need to talk to him about how much he would actually really love this.
And while believers right now who are doing what they can in their life to keep these commandments for their lives, yet we're in the dispersion, which means, and that was prophesied in multiple places in Scripture, we've been scattered out of the land. We're no longer the temple's not there, the Levites are not there, and the kingdom to come is not here. Right? Yeshua is still above the firmament at this point. He hasn't returned on the day of the Lord. So we do the best we can right now to keep in honorance and remembrance of these things, even though we don't have a priest to take our offerings to, right?
Yeah.
And there's no temple set up and all that stuff, but we do the best we can to observe and remember these for the reasons given to us while we can where we are right now, all across the
provision
planet.
for that here in these chapters we just read, where he says if it's too far away, you can eat it where you're at.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who say, oh well, we can't keep those because we don't have a temple to go to, they're also not reading the whole, the whole book for that context. So. 1
Chronicles 22, 6:13.
Okay.
I think that's our first pairing from the prophets. So let's flip to that real quick.
And this is going to go back to what I mentioned earlier about those verses being fulfilled during the reign of Solomon. And something Sean pointed out to me when we were doing this study, that there was peace during the time of Solomon, and I kind of have always just glazed over that and never really noticed that there was peace during Solomon's reign. So. Yes,
there was, because and this is not the most popular statement, but Solomon is a great, metaphor example of the future reign of Jesus Christ from Zion, from the New Jerusalem to come. Yes, Solomon was not a perfect king. He messed up at the end of his life. His heart was led astray. We get that, and I think it's First Kings 11. But at the same time, as far as a type and shadow, the typology of a king full of wisdom, a king who's got all the money.
Yeah.
He said he was the richest king ever in the earth that ever will be. Until Zion comes, obviously. And then of course there was peace in the land and in his kingdom during his reign. So I think that it's a wonderful pointing towards the millennial reign to come. All right, and let's see. 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 6 through 13. Verse 6 says, Then he summoned his son Solomon and instructed him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. My son, David said to Solomon, It was in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and waged great wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed so much blood on the ground before me. But a son will be born to you. He will be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies, for his name will be Solomon. And I will give him peace and quiet to Israel during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name. He will be my son. I will be his father. I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. Now, my son, may the Lord be with you, and may you succeed in building the house of the Lord your God, as he said about you. Above all, may the Lord give you insight and understanding when he puts you in charge of Israel, so that you may keep the law of the Lord your God. Then you will be successful. Then you will succeed if you carefully follow the statutes and ordinances the Lord commanded Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged. All right.
So obviously we see that language of rest And we know from the context that to enter into his rest is entering into the kingdom. It's that final. A lot of people talk about the Sabbath day, the 1,000-year reign on our 6,000 or 7,000 year calendar or whatever.
And as was promised to Solomon, or as was promised to David to tell Solomon, was that Solomon's kingdom was gonna have rest from his surrounding enemies. Right. Okay, so we actually see this prophesied in Psalm 110 verse 4 about Yeshua, about the Messiah. Okay, that he goes to sit at the Father's right hand until all of his enemies are made a footstool, until they're all rounded up, gathered out, so that on the day of the Lord, when Yeshua returns with his angels and they clear out the area of the New Jerusalem and all the wicked that are trying to fight him in the land there, that's his enemies. All right, so the house of the Lord that's promised to be built by Solomon does not happen until the enemies are subdued and there's quiet, so to speak, and there's from all the the chaos that the wicked would try to bring about in that land. Okay, so we see this fulfilled in the eternal spectrum with Yeshua's coming at the second coming, when he and the angels take care of the wicked, the cordoned off area of the New Jerusalem is taken care of. The New Jerusalem sets down, but it only comes down after all the enemies have been subdued.
Right.
So that's where this is a huge parallel to the kingdom with what's going on here with Solomon. But in the same vein, we also get this wonderful concept of this is in the middle. If I could say, Deuteronomy was at the beginning of the story and Yeshua is the fulfillment of the story. Yeah. Then David and Solomon is kind of in the middle of the story. I know it's kind of a loose reference, but what I'm getting at is we've got Deuteronomy telling us in these chapters that they're going to go into the land. This is where they do their sacrifices, their burnt offerings, their grain offerings, once we build a house for the name of the Lord. And then we see this same kind of stuff promised for the circumstances of when Solomon gets to build this house and fulfill the promises in Deuteronomy, to build once the Father chose a place for his name to dwell and he can actually build the house, we get it fulfilled in the circumstances of that fulfillment is absolutely the kingdom.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's just kind of a short little example they had in their past of this idea that we get to see fulfilled eternally with Yeshua, and I just think it's beautiful. We also got 1 Kings 5 and chapter 5 verses 1 through 5. And do you want to read this one, sweetie?
Sure. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that he had been anointed king in his father's place, for Hiram had always been friends with David. Solomon sent this message to Hiram: "You know my father David was not able to build a temple for the name of the Lord his God. This was because of all the warfare all around him, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. The Lord my God has now given me rest all around. There is no enemy or crisis. So I plan to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, according to what the Lord promised my father David. I will put your son on your throne in your place, and he will build a temple for my name." So obvious why we chose that.
Yep, that's what we were just talking about. There was a conditional moment there, and that same condition we see reflected when Yeshua returns.
Right. And people often forget that David is idiomatically used to speak of Yeshua at times. Yes. So a lot of times we'll talk about the kingdom and we'll quote certain passages from like Ezekiel, for example, and people will say, many in the Judaism camp will say, well, that's David. That's promise made to David, literally David. But we know Yeshua was hidden in the Torah. He hadn't been revealed yet, and so other names are used, other people are used to like idiomatically represent him.
Yes.
And be a type and shadow of him.
Right. I mean, he's the actual name Yeshua is not named, but there are prophets that speak about him and about the descriptions of him, and they use an idiomatic term. For example, we have in the book of Enoch, we get the description of his kingship. He's called the Son of Man.
Yeah.
And with the context of calling him the Son of Man and telling him how he sits with the Father on his throne of authority and he judges the nations, as we see fulfilled in Revelation and Matthew 24 and other places, all that context is about his kingship, okay, and the authority that goes with that.
Yeah.
But then we've got passages like Isaiah 11, like Ezekiel, I think it's 37 or 38 maybe.
Where 36 and 37.
We've got other references and where it talks about his righteousness and it calls him the branch in Isaiah, and it calls him the root of Jesse in Ezekiel. Okay, Enoch calls him the plant of righteousness, right? Which is still a plant has a branch and a root, right?
Yeah.
It's the same concept, and it's about it's these idiomatic phrases are spoken of in lieu of a name because it's talking about an attribute of his character,
right?
If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, many times David, because David was promised a throne forever, right? Because he was obedient to the Lord. And this is the same conditional promise that was given to Solomon, saying, look, if you continue to follow me, I'll establish a throne forever for you. But we know that because of what was promised to David, that's where we see the fulfillment of that in Yeshua, who gets a throne established forever, who is a descendant of David, right? He says, oh, have one of your descendants on the throne forever. And then we get that fulfillment in the millennial reign and eternity. But at the same time, it's because it's speaking about, it will say, David, my servant. I think it says that in Ezekiel and Isaiah a couple times.
Yeah.
And it's talking about not the King David of, the second king of Israel back in the day, 3,000 years ago, because he's going to take part in the first resurrection. Right? He's not the firstborn among the dead. He's not the head of the church. He is not the king of Zion. He was never promised to be the king of Zion.
Right.
In fact, in the Psalms, he prophesies about the king of Zion, and it's
Right.
not him. Okay, he's not prophesying about himself, right? So the king of Zion was prophesied way before David, all the way back to Enoch, so pre-flood. So just for those who try to say that this is going to be somehow actually David, who's going to come back and be the Messiah, you guys aren't. Again, we got to read our books. We've got to read the books and take everything in context, and that's where the Messiah is given these idiomatic terms to describe a type of his personality or character. Right. And so that's anyway, just for FYI.
It's just an example of when the context is dictating whether to take something literally or figuratively. So this is a good example of when the context is dictating that we don't actually literally apply that to that King David from 3,000 years ago. The surrounding context and the attributes being spoken of, we know, we can tell those are Messianic. Those are about Yeshua.
That's right.
So,
which is why we don't get any idiomatic references to the Messiah to Hezekiah, although Hezekiah was a righteous king. Right? Because that doesn't line up with the context of everything we just described, much less the covenant to David, right? Because that kind of covenant wasn't given to Hezekiah. So there's context involved. That's why we call this kingdom in context. All right. So let's look at the next pairing, Psalm 110:4. This is actually going to be something we just mentioned and referenced real quick.
Yeah. The Lord has sworn an oath and will not take it back. Forever you are a priest like Melchizedek.
Yes. So this is just the idea here of Yeshua fulfilling the priesthood in the millennial reign. And that's the idea of that only happens after the enemies have been abolished and rooted out of the land, and the temple in New Jerusalem has come down, which is called the house, the paradise of God, the house of God, the dwelling place of the Almighty. It's come down, and then Yeshua reigns as both king and high priest on Mount Zion. And it is in the order of Melchizedek, which was an order of priesthood that was not under the lineage of Levites, as we have, established in not only the Torah but also the Book of Jubilees. I think it's chapter 31. So that's why we have statements, sweetie. Like, it's I want to say it's the beginning of Hebrews chapter 5, where it says that I think it's in verse 1 or 2, where it talks about if Jesus were on earth, he would not even be a priest, because they already have the Levites. They already have people to offer the gifts and the sacraments and the offerings and everything instructed in the law. Which is why we see when the kingdom comes in Isaiah 66, it says he picks new Levites. Right? He gets new Levites from that bloodline, from that descendancy to minister, and there's a contextual caveat there, and that's for the survivors who are going to be outside of the kingdom, right? And the survivors outside the New Jerusalem, because all the resurrected saints inside the Jerusalem, we're the royal priesthood, right? Yeah. In the same order, Melchizedek is Yeshua, but he's our high priest, right? So just like the Levites had a high priest with lesser priests below them, that'll be the structure of hierarchy and relationship between Yeshua, who's our high priest in Melchizedek order, and then we're the lesser priests below him. So that's anyway, just throwing these things out there to give a little bit more. Jubilees. So this one was in chapter 46. This is our extra biblical pairing. The Book of Jubilees, if you're not aware, it's in the Eastern Orthodox Ethiopian canon. It's been in there for over 2,000 years, It's a book. Modern day Ethiopians are descendants of the Levites who were scattered, which I would believe, 2,600 years ago, and they are actually in the past, during the days of Yeshua, they became believers after Yeshua. So these are modern descendants of the tribe of Levi. So that's our priesthood within in the Torah. That is the priesthood given within the Torah, and they now believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, and so they're Christian. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so in their Bible, they have this book called the Book of Jubilees that they follow its calendar days for a lot of their feasts. And so we're going to read out of our portion here in chapter 46, verses 1 through 3. And it says, "And it came to pass that after Jacob died, the children of Israel multiplied in the land of Egypt. They became a great nation, and they were of one accord in heart, so that brother loved brother, and every man helped his brother. And they increased abundantly, and multiplied exceedingly, 10 weeks of years, all the days of the life of Joseph. And there was no Satan, nor any evil, all the days of the life of Joseph, which he lived after his father Jacob. For all the Egyptians honored the children of Israel all the days of the life of Joseph. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. 17 years he lived in the land of Canaan, and 10 years he was a servant, and 3 years in prison. And 80 years he was under the king, ruling all the land of Egypt." All right.
So
A lot of fun.
As we started to read this portion and figure out what we wanted to talk about, we immediately noticed the kingdom behavior going on in chapter 12, and the talk of rest from the enemies when you enter into the land. And it immediately made me think of this story in Jubilees about the time of Joseph in the land of Egypt. And what's very interesting about this specifically is verse 2 that says, "And there was no Satan nor any evil all the days of the life of Joseph." So we see that paralleled, of course, in the millennial reign, because we know from Revelation that at the beginning of that reign, Satan is locked up for that period of time. We will have rest from our enemy. Our enemy, as we all know, is that chief fallen angel and all of his minions.
And that's where we have this idea of Joseph is another typology. He's another great symbol of Yeshua and reigning, because he reigned not only over his own people, but even over foreigners, so to speak. Even though, let me say that the right way. They're living in the land of Egypt, so they're not in the land. We understand that, okay? Joseph, we know the story. His brothers betrayed him, sold him into slavery. He went through his own adventures and shenanigans, and then, the Lord vindicated him, right? And got him out of jail and rose him to power, second in command of all of Egypt, and he ruled over Egypt as kind of like a viceroy or a vice president or whatever. But the Pharaoh did whatever whatever Joseph wanted, because Joseph was incredibly wise, okay, and God was with him, all right, and he was part of reigning, and Egypt was blessed because of Joseph, and they honored him greatly throughout his life and also at his death, and then he was allowed to bring his 70 descendants down from the land of Canaan, and then they started flourishing. And as it said, they were in one accord, loved each other, and they were honored by the Egyptians, right? So we get this little backstory of history during the life of the reign of Joseph, and that reign is perfectly representative of what we see with Yeshua.
Yeah.
Okay, because Joseph, he also, I think it's Genesis 45. No. It could be Genesis 45, but we talked about in the first Torah portion that Joseph even apportioned areas off for the Levite priests. He gave them their own land. Yep. Okay, even though they weren't to have an inheritance long term, but he plotted off some land for them in Egypt to have, since they weren't supposed to have their own apportioned land forever. But he basically gave them some land to stay in, if I could put it like that, so they wouldn't have to stay in the dwellings of their other brethren of the other tribes and be a burden or anything. So he's making provisions for the priests. He's caring for those who are possibly not of the family of Israel, right? All the Egyptians, and ruling over them with righteous and justice, and they love him for it. And we get his own family is blessed and multiplies exceedingly as a result, in which fulfills some of the promises to Abraham leading up to the days of Moses. And so this is an amazing moment where he just typifies what we're going to see when Yeshua returns. And we have the people that have survived the day of the Lord are going to love Yeshua because he's righteous, truthful. There's abundance of provision. He takes care of us with love and justice. And the caveat being, they're going to learn Torah behavior.
Yeah.
Right? And if they don't, we got Zechariah 14, which is that those people who refuse to take part in these feasts that we read about in Deuteronomy Chapter 16, that they don't get any rain in their land. So there's, and they're supposed to be learning Torah. Right. Yeah. They're supposed to be, there is enforcement involved, just like the Torah. There's enforcement involved for those who want to be around others who are doing the Torah, who want to be in the land. You got to do the laws of the land. You got to do the rules, the instructions of the land. So I think that's a wonderful thing. If you've never read Jubilees, check it out when you have a chance.
Yeah, Joseph is probably one of the most famous types and shadows of Yeshua. I mean, we see whole teachings, whole charts, that go through all the similarities between Joseph and Yeshua. And if you want just even more, gems to toss around into that mix, Jubilees is great as far as some backstory about Joseph that you don't necessarily hear about in Genesis. Jubilees is called the Lesser Genesis traditionally. So you will find some things in the Lesser Genesis about Joseph that are also very clearly, you'll read it or listen to it on audio and you'll immediately be like, oh my gosh, that's type and shadow of Jesus. That's type and shadow of Jesus. It's a really fun read. I love it. So our next pairing from the New Testament, also called the Brit Hadasha, is going to be Revelation 19.
So in Revelation 19, I think it's in verse 11.
Jeez, you got a big index back here.
That's right.
I got a whole dictionary back here. Okay. So chapter 19 and verses 11 through 21. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a fiery flame, and on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knows except himself. He wore a robe stained with blood, and his name is called the Word of God. The armies that were in heaven followed him on white horses, wearing pure white linen. From his mouth came a sharp sword, so that with it he might strike the nations. He will shepherd them with an iron scepter. He will also trample the winepress of the fierce anger of God, the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out in a loud voice, saying to all the birds flying in mid-heaven, Come, gather together for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of commanders, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and of their riders, and the flesh of everyone, both free and slave, small and great. Then I saw the beast, the kings of the earth, and their armies, gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and against his army. But the beast was taken prisoner, and along with him the false prophet, who had performed signs on his authority, by which he deceived those who accepted the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. Both of them were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. The rest were killed with the sword that came from the mouth of the rider and the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh.
All right, so what are we seeing?
Well, obviously, enemies being put out of commission, so to speak.
That's right. So we're seeing Torah enforcement.
Yeah.
Guys, we got the lawgiver who is the embodiment of the Word of God, who is Yeshua comes back, and the angels are following the Torah in heaven. Yeshua is the Torah made flesh, if you can put it like that. He's always going to do the Torah. He's always going to do God's instructions for living. And part of that is those who try to fight against you and rebel against you, or those who try to lead other people astray, which is what the false prophet and the beast are doing during those times, forcing people to take the mark of the beast or killing them, right? And then we also see in Revelation 13 tells us the false prophet and the beast work under the authority of Satan. And we have Revelation 12 tells us in Revelation 12:17 that Satan is persecuting those who hold the testimony of Jesus and keep the commandments of God. So those three characters are trying to do what Deuteronomy 13 was talking about.
Right.
They're trying to get people to stop following the commandments of God. And what did I say? It requires someone else who's following the Torah to step up and enforce the Torah.
Yeah.
And Jesus does that at his return.
Yeah.
And he enforces it in a great way.
Yeah.
Right? That's why all the prophets talk about the day of the Lord. All of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, that seems to be almost a litmus test for having a valid prophecy, is at some point during your prophecy, you're talking about the day of the Lord.
Right.
If not, the bulk of your prophecy is all about the day of the Lord. Book of Joel, filled with the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
Book of Habakkuk, Amos,
Obadiah.
Isaiah, ridiculous
Yeah.
amounts of talk about in Isaiah about the New Jerusalem, the day of the Lord, and what's going to happen at that transitionary period.
Yeah.
So I think that the reason why we want to include that in this pairing is because this is the actual fulfillment, practical application of what we read about what's instructed for the Israelites to behave as.
Right.
Right, in Deuteronomy 13, when it's talking about addressing false prophets. The Antichrist, false prophet, he literally got a henchman called the false prophet by Scripture, right? So this is the Father fulfilling His word and showing us how it's done. Can I put it like that? Right? So I just think that this is an amazing fulfillment. If you've ever wondered why it looks so harsh in Revelation 19, go back to Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's already been expressed to us. It's already been told how He would behave in that circumstance.
Right.
And we watch Him behave like that in the future in that circumstance.
Yeah.
All right? I included a small other portion from the Brit. It's just Luke 6:38. I wanted to read it real quick because it lines up with what we read in Deuteronomy 15, which is about the debts being canceled and given to the poor. And so I think it's in verses 7 through 8 where it talks about not being tight-fisted or hard-hearted when you give to the poor.
Yeah.
And so
stingy is what your translation
my
says.
translation is stingy. And so it's in Deuteronomy 15 and verses 7 through 9. But the pairing I wanted to give for that is what Jesus actually talked about in Luke 6:38 when He was talking about, He says, give and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure it will be measured to you in return. And so, and this to me, it was just, the surrounding context here, like in verse 35, He's talking about love your enemies, do good, and lend nothing expecting in return. And He's just talking about, the heart and the example that we see that was instructed to them in Deuteronomy 15, which was, you're going to have poor people around you, give to the poor, and do not be tight-fisted or hard-hearted in that. Now, does that mean that we're just going to give to people that once you choose to be poor, right? That fully able-bodied people that choose to be poor, that's between you and God.
Yeah.
Okay? If you want to go out and decide that person can think straight, they can walk straight, and there's nothing impeding them from going out and finding work, okay? And you decide that you still want to give to them because of their poor in circumstances, that's up to you. Now there's other people that already have a job, that already are stable, they got a family, and they run into bad circumstances. Right. And maybe you need to give to them, right? So that's by all means, let the Father work on your heart to do what you feel is appropriate. But we have to be, a judge in these things. But I think more than anything, the Father would have us lean towards generosity more than, trying to qualify how poor is He.
Right.
Right? And does He really, you know what I'm saying? So that's where, because He's trying to address the heart here, which is why He mentions stuff like don't be hard-hearted and stingy and tight-fisted. Okay? So He's trying to express, He's asking you to soften your heart, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then He's trying to encourage us in Luke 6 by saying when we do these things, that we can be, in a sense, be rewarded, right? It'll be given unto you. With the same measure you give, it'll be given back to you. And so that's not exactly the follow-up that we got in Deuteronomy. He was only addressing the heart in Deuteronomy, but in Luke 6, Jesus, speaking in the same vein of giving, is addressing the outcome as well, and that's what the law will do in all regards for you. Right. God's instructions will only come back positively to you, right? And what I love about this portion of Deuteronomy is what I've mentioned earlier, right? Which is abiding by these instructions and doing all these things that were commanded for them, for the feasts and the sacrifices and all the things. It resulted in joy, right? So that's will be the same thing that's going to happen when we give to those in need, and then it's going to result in joy. The same thing is going to happen when you do any of the commandments of God. Right. It's going to result in joy.
Well, as we read in Deuteronomy, He promises to bless us for obedience.
That's right.
And, just the opposite end of that coin, cursing for disobedience. That's right.
Well, that's in chapter 12. We get that they were instructed to go up there and read off those things. Later in Deuteronomy, we're going to read those things.
Yeah.
I think it's chapter 27, 28 maybe. But we're going to actually...
You would know off the top of your head more than I.
We'll read about those later.
He's the Sean-cyclopedia over here. Always knowing which chapter and verse things are in. I got to go Google it.
Yeah,
I'll get there someday.
We'll dig into further about the blessings and curses later, but I just want to encourage everyone this week. I hope it was a productive study for you.
Yeah.
There is a lot of fun stuff in Deuteronomy, and especially because Jesus quoted from this book a lot.
Yeah.
I think we talked about that a couple weeks ago. And I hope that you guys are able to take some of the stuff that we've talked about tonight and realize how easy it is to apply it into your lives, because that's what's going to bring you joy.
Yeah.
Okay? So, any things you'd like to say before we go, Sweetie?
Just want to encourage people, that these things can be understood as long as we're reading everything in context, and as long as we let the Bible define its own terms, and as long as we let the context dictate when something is literal, when it's figurative, and all of that. And I just, all these things that we're reading about, with generosity and taking care of each other, we're going to be living that in the kingdom. And I just always picture to myself, how Abraham is promised to be a blessing to the nations. And so it's not just about Jesus coming and us having a way to God through Jesus and that being a blessing to the nations. We're literally going to be a blessing to all the nations around us when we're living in the kingdom. They're going to come and buy without money. They're going to come and enjoy these amazing feasts with us. And it's just going to be the literal fulfillment of the commandment to love your neighbor. And I just think that's beautiful, and it's really just something to really think about when you're reading these portions. Just think about how this is all going to be played out in the kingdom, and how we're going to get to really love our neighbor and really bless the nations.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's why everything was promised to Abraham was all leading up to the fulfillment at the return of Yeshua and the kingdom come. So that could be why Jesus prayed, "Kingdom come, your will be done."
Come, yes.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. It's been fun this week. This week could keep going, but because I get excited talking about the Bible, and I could just keep going and going. But we got to stop. So
yeah, we've kept you long enough, and the dogs have been quiet for long enough.
Yes,
so.
Thank you, Father. So we just thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back here next week. Shabbat shalom.
Thanks, guys. Shabbat shalom. Have a good week.